The tutorial of Rebel Inc. doesn't teach you how to play the game, it teaches you how to use the game. What I mean by this is that you learn how to buy upgrades, move troops, and destroy insurgents, but not why you should do those things or how to do them effectively. For example, the game has you buy a few civilian upgrades for your population, telling you that they will help stabilize regions. It does not tell you that some upgrades are more effective than others, can multiply the effectiveness of other upgrades, or that certain government upgrades are practically required to help you stabilize regions. At no point did I know why I was buying these upgrades, other than you need this to win, with little explanation of what each upgrade does. Yes, the game gives descriptions of what everything does when you're playing the game, but not in the tutorial. The tutorial moves too fast and leaves little room for players to experience things for themselves. Constant pop-ups and grayouts distract the player from familiarizing themselves with the UI and how to effectively utilize it. Even the arrows guiding you through the tutorial cover up the informational text, making it difficult or impossible to read. In addition to all this, the fact that the tutorial is split into two parts doesn't help to give an impression of how the game actually plays. The game isn't about stabilization and then military conquest. It's about balancing those two objectives with a constrained budget and corruption on the rise. The tutorial doesn't even mention peace talks, one of the most important endgame events. So what can be done to fix all this? Here's my pitch. The tutorial should not be a forced rails set of instruction, but instead should walk players through an entire game from setting up an HQ all the way to peace talks. Let's start by setting some ground rules. The things to immediately ban from the tutorial are arrows and grayouts. Instead, highlight important items in colorblind friendly colored boxes that pulse. This will draw the attention of players, but still allow them to click on and manipulate other things in the UI. There's a lot of information to take in when playing Rebel Inc., and covering it up with grayouts just leads to confusion. The second rule is not to give unprompted information or pop-ups. In the current tutorial, you constantly feed the player with information that overwhelms new players. Throwing too much at a player at once makes it so stuff doesn't stick. If you sit back and give players a bit of agency, they'll retain the information better. Pop-ups should occur in response to player actions, they should not be unprompted. In addition, you should allow players to interact with things they haven't learned about. If they're curious, let them explore and give them a pop-up that says we'll cover this later in the tutorial, but feel free to look around now. But on to the tutorial itself and how it should be structured. The tutorial will start with governor and advisor selection, offering some simple explanations of how these work and how to unlock more. The game will then put you into saffron fields and tell you a bit about selecting an HQ location. It will then highlight urban, rural, and remote zones. Clicking on each one gives a description of how initiatives are rolled out into each zone, how military action is affected, and the road systems usually in each area. It would also say whether or not this kind of region is good for an HQ. Once the player has clicked on and learned about all three regions, the game will then let them pick a location for their HQ. If they try to pick a remote location or a rural area without any good road access, don't let them, and tell them to look for a better place. Once they get it right, they'll feel smart and are likely to pick a good spot in the future. Once the HQ is placed, pause the game and highlight the region stability bar. Once again, if they click on other things like the Operations tab or the Region tab, let them, and tell them you'll cover this at a later time. Once they click on the bar, don't send them to the Regional Information tab, but instead tell them how they win the game with supporters. After that, highlight the Operations tab and then the Civilian tab, before finally highlighting the three initiatives to be clicked on. When the player clicks on each of them, provide a description of what each one does and then expand the tree showing everything in it. Then, highlight each subsection and require the player to click on that to learn more about it. You may be wondering why go through all this when the tooltips already exist. You should do this to give context. Mention to a player that early game you'll likely want to use education thanks to its fast rollout, and that once you have a less hostile population in the mid-game, the job creation initiatives are helpful. Make it clear to players why they should choose these things instead of just telling the player what they do. Once the Civilian tab has been explained, repeat this whole process with government information until every group of initiatives has been explained to the player. Then let the player buy initiatives on their own, creating a pop-up when they buy enough initiatives to trigger inflation. You could also give the player a small amount of money and tell them to spend it all, and when they run out, highlight the X in the top right-hand corner. This would give a natural way to stop them and explain inflation. When the player returns to the main screen, the pause and speed up time menu should be highlighted. Much of the rest of the tutorial would continue like this. The game gets paused, important items are highlighted, clicking on the items creates a pop-up that has crucial information, and then the game continues until the next piece of information is needed. Additionally, the military part of the tutorial would not focus on the surrounding and destroying of insurgents, but instead on how to use soldiers to gather intel on faraway zones and how to push back and keep insurgents out of urban and rural zones. The game should teach you that sometimes it's worth it to pull your troops out of a losing fight, and that coalition troops that aren't deployed to a combat zone stick around longer than those who are. Finally, the game should walk you through the peace process at the end of the game and should force you to agree to a peace deal with the insurgents. This way, players get a sense of the entire game from start to finish. Now, some of you might protest the fact that I'm new to the game and that I just haven't played enough to make these kinds of requests for the game to be changed. I would say the opposite is important. Getting the insight of a new player is important, as newer players may play the tutorial, lose repeatedly, and then quit. I nearly did, and I don't want other new players to go through the same struggles I did. If you have constructive criticism or comments, leave it in the comments. I'd be happy to reply and take all your points into consideration. Thanks for watching. There's a lot of information to take in when playing Rebel Inc., and covering it up with grayouts leads to unfamiliarity. Cripes. There's a lot of information to take in when playing Rebel Inc., and covering it up with grayouts just leads to unfamiliar. Alright, that's it. I'm just going to replace with confusion.